In case you aren't familiar by now, Frankenstein was written in Geneva in the summer of 1816, which is the famous year without a summer. There was a volcanic eruption in Indonesia that year, and it sent ash all over Europe. So the summer was very cold and rainy. So a group of authors who were vacationing in like this lake house decided that they were going to pass the time by writing some scary stories. And this included Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Polidori, among a few others. And Mary Shelley's story came to her in a dream and would go on to become Frankenstein. And in the second edition of the novel, which was published in 1831, you will find this passage in the introduction. I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited me to this task, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood, and quicken the beating of the heart. Now, this is not the introduction that you get in the first edition. In the first edition, here's what you get. Two other friends, a tale from the pen of one of whom would be far more acceptable to the public than anything I could ever hope to produce, and myself agreed to write each a story founded on some supernatural occurrence. The weather, however, suddenly became serene, and my two friends left me on a journey among the Alps, and lost in the magnificent scenes which they present all memory of their ghostly visions. The following tale is the only one which has been completed. So basically, what Shelley is saying is the only reason that her story is the one that people remember from this summer is that it's the only one that was finished. And if the others hadn't decided to go hiking instead, well, they would have finished theirs and theirs would be better and everybody would remember their story. So don't give Mary Shelley too much credit. That's what the introduction to the first edition said. Except John Polidori's The Vampire did get published a few years later. We have a lot of Byron's story too. We know they weren't better. They exist. And even worse, Mary Shelley did not write that introduction. Her husband, Percy Shelley, wrote that introduction. And he pretended to be her. He wrote it in her voice, apologizing for how bad it was and how much better of a job he could have done if he could have been bothered. So the first edition, to make matters worse, the one in which that introduction appeared, was published anonymously. For a long time, there was even debate about whether Percy Shelley was the one who wrote Frankenstein, because a lot of people thought that a woman couldn't have done it. And a lot of that had to do with the social roles of the genders in Victorian society. But it's patently absurd when you consider that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the most highly respected intellectuals and authors of the time. But just like Mary Shelley couldn't help but face her society's ideas about what was appropriate for women, and believe me, Victorian England had some very strong ideas about what was appropriate for both men and women. And Mary Shelley was very fond of breaking them. Her work can't help but reflect those ideas. So you're going to see a lot of that going on in Frankenstein, both deliberately and kind of under the surface. So in Victorian society, you have this kind of idea of spheres of influence, and men belong to the public sphere and women belong to the private sphere. So they're what's called the angels of the house. So men do business, they drink together, they gamble, they do explorations into, Africa. They fight, they go to war, they are the ones that get learned and do science. And they hang out with other men and each other. They don't really like hanging out with women or their own family or raising children. And women are the ones who nourish and nurture and take care of the babies and do the cleaning and the cooking. And these two spheres of influence are meant to be very rigidly separated. Again, kind of middle class and up. When you're talking about working class people, it doesn't really follow these rules. Sex with spouses is for producing children. Husbands don't really like their wives. And when you hear a lot of kind of modern gender theorists talking about the terms toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, they're talking about these rigid gender roles, and most of that comes to us from Victorian society. So if you've ever heard the complaint that, men aren't allowed to show emotions, or that women are supposed to want to have children, and if they don't, there's something wrong with them, well, you have Victorians to thank for that. And we definitely see this being reflected in our text. So, Victor doesn't seem to have the capacity to love. He's not really interested in it. And it's not that that's something that's broken in him per se, as it is that that's a reflection of how men in his kind of social status are meant to be. He doesn't think about the fact that his creature is going to be this, creepy, deformed giant when he's making it. He just thinks that that's going to be easier to put together. And when the consequences come in terms of it being terrifying, he doesn't think about what that means for his creature. He just runs away and kind of hopes it'll sort itself out. He doesn't have the ability to empathize with this being that he's bringing into the world. The men who do have the capacity to love in this story don't end well. If you think just of his little brother who's carrying that photograph around with him, and that's what causes him to be murdered. And this loving act also gives the creature the ability to frame Justine. And then Victor also here refuses to take responsibility. He doesn't show any love for Justine, who's someone he's known for a very long time. He just allows her to be punished for his own mistakes and actions, and just lets her die for it. Caroline suffers, his mother. She has this expectation that she's going to be a caregiver, for which, she contracts scarlet fever and dies. Even the model that they have in this novel of a family that's kind of outside of these norms, where men are allowed to love and women are allowed to be a bit more kind of active in their household, which is the DeLacy family. It's a family of outsiders. You have a blind man, you have immigrants, they're very poor, they're living outside of society, but even they can't maintain this idea of love. The men fall right back into this idea of I'm protector when the creature shows up, right? And they fall back into these gender standards. And all of the female characters, they end up filling the normative kind of social role set to them by Victorian society. They're very passive. They're definitely caregivers. Obviously, we've already mentioned Caroline. But think about how she came into the family. She's under the protection of Victor's father, Alphonse, for 2 years after her father died, and then she married Alphonse, which is very murky by today's standards in terms of consent. Did she have a choice? It seems she's just kind of being passed from person to person. Justine even confessed to that crime that she didn't commit. She says, God knows how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestation should acquit me, because who's going to believe a woman, right? There's absolutely nothing to connect her to it at all except for a photograph. And that's it. But she doesn't really protest being framed because she kind of knows what the outcome's going to be. Agatha DeLacy, she mostly just exists to teach the creature kindness from a distance. Safie is a means to him learning language, and both of them are completely passive when Felix flips out when he sees the creature in the cottage and allows him to be chased away. They don't speak up or have any opinion on that at all. Elizabeth, Victor's betrothed, is often described as a possession, which of course is perfectly in line with Victorian norms. And also here, the two editions give a little bit of a different backstory to Elizabeth. The original has her as a cousin who moves in, and then the revised edition, the second edition, she's this kind of romantically distressed daughter of this impoverished noble family that the Frankenstein's taken, which is definitely more in line with the dark romantic aesthetic, which you have a kind of the decay and fall of these kind of nobility. But either way, they're raised together with this plan from the beginning that Elizabeth is meant for Victor, and that's just how it's supposed to be. So you can see why people thought that a man wrote this. There were definitely female authors of the day, but they wrote what's called a domestic novel. So they were writing about women. Women were their protagonists, and they were talking about their lives in the home, what they did all day and their inner thoughts and things like that. So they stuck to their spheres. They're not writing stories like Frankenstein. And a lot of people have questioned, why would Mary Shelley, a woman whose mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was kind of a proto-feminist, write about women in this way, this passive way where they don't have any agency? But remember what horror is about. Horror is about fear. So you also have to remember who is ultimately telling us this story, and it's Walton, and he's telling it to his sister. So he's filtering these events through his own lens, and he has a purpose for telling them to her, right? Because why? For what reason do we have this weird envelope narrative where we have Walton telling the story? There's no need to do that unless you have a purpose. So he is telling her perhaps a lesson. Well, look at how these women behaved in this story. All the women who die in the story do so passively. They're like gently accepting their fate and their duty. And ultimately, it's also a lesson to Victor Frankenstein. And perhaps what this says about Victorian society is the actual fear about what Mary Shelley's writing. She's writing a fear about how broken these roles are. And about how, Walton and Victor are very, very alike. And yes, he's learning a lesson about science and about tempting God, but is he also learning the lesson he needs to be learning about society and social roles?